LDI 3.3. In this LDI, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the additional things that come about when designing a study, okay? Be it an observational study or an experiment. So one of the things we're going to look at is when we deal with multiple variables that are going on in a situation and some of the vocabulary that goes along with it. So to start off with, let's take a look at these two definitions, what we mean by levels and what we mean by treatments, okay? So the possible values of the explanatory variable are called the levels of the variable. A treatment is a specific combination of levels of the explanatory variables. So notice big change here, explanatory variables. So it's possible at times to have more than one explanatory variable that we're working with. And you may have different categories among each of those explanatory variables. Now, just as a quick reminder, this is something I wrote it earlier, but I better stop here and take a second to remind you, is that explanatory variables also can be called factors, okay? So you're going to see explanatory variable, okay? A short variable, let's put that on there. The explanatory variable, a shorthand for explanatory variable, or another way of writing that would be factor, okay? Now remember, mathematicians as a rule are a lazy lot, and so they're going to write down the least they can get away with. So which of those two you think they're going to pick? You know, you got it, factor. And more often than not, you're going to see factor and not explanatory variable. Okay, let's take a look at an example out of the textbook that maybe will help make this a little more transparent in what we're talking about, okay? So we have two explanatory variables here. The two explanatory variables that we're going to be working with in this case are a high fiber diet and exercise. So those are my two explanatory variables, and my response variable that I'm working with is the reduction in heart attacks, or you can just think about it as the percentage of heart attacks, okay? So the explanatory variables are high fiber and exercise, and the response that we're looking for is the amount of heart attacks. Now notice that we have two factors going on here, okay, or two explanatory variables. So make sure you keep that straight, that factors are the same as explanatory variables. So our first factor is type of diet, okay, so that's factor number one. And factor number two is the amount of exercise. Now notice that we have two levels to factor one. You either have a high fiber diet or you have the standard American diet, okay? We have three levels going on with the second factor. We've got high exercise, moderate exercise, and low exercise, okay? So now if you take a combination of those treatments, if you have the high exercise, high fiber, so we've got like the Lance Armstrong wannabes there, that would be a treatment group number one, okay, the people who qualified in there. Now down over here at the other end of the extreme, we've got the low exercise with the standard fiber. That's the guy who's eating the bag of nachos, drinking a Budweiser, watching NASCAR in his Barca Lounger. That's treatment group number 6, okay? So the treatments are set up by being combinations of the explanatory variables or of the factors, all right? Hopefully that makes sense. So another thing that's very important to talk about with respect to setting up any sort of a study or a experiment that we're doing are confounding variables. That really is actually an important topic. Confounding variables, a variable's effect on the response variable, cannot be separated from the effect on the explanatory variable on the response variable. A good example was, I don't know if you watch, or excuse me, listen to Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. There was a little thing where they were talking about on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, which is a radio show on NPR, about there was recently a study released from Japan saying that there was a relationship between eating breakfast and teenage pregnancy among girls. And they found that there was a relationship where that if the teenage girls ate breakfast, there was a marked reduction in teenage pregnancies. So the explanatory variable here is the eating breakfast, and the response variable is pregnancy. Well, obviously the breakfast really has nothing to do with the pregnancy per se. The confounding variable involved was that what they saw is that girls who ate breakfast tended to have more parental supervision. Their parents were helping them eat breakfast, getting them off to school, and more involved in their lives than the girls who didn't eat breakfast. So the confounding variable was parent involvement. It wasn't the breakfast that was deterring the teenage pregnancies, okay? All right, so let's take a look at another example here. What if the majority of men in our fiber exercise study that have standard fiber and low exercise also smoke? Now, the other treatments don't have this property. In other words, we're talking about our NASCAR living guys back there in treatment group 6. Well, if we didn't remove the variable for smoking in there, it could totally throw off our results. It could be that the diet and the exercise didn't have anything to do with it at all, but the fact that those guys were smoking that was causing it, okay? So we didn't measure this variable, yet it may be a large factor in the response variable. So it's important that you try and limit as many of these confounding variables or other variables as possible to help see the relationship between the explanatory and the response variable. Okay, so let's get on to LDI 3.3. All right, hey, we're finally there. So invasive versus non-invasive cancer treatments. So researchers examined the records of a large number of cancer patients. Some patients received an invasive treatment while others received a non-invasive treatment. Patients who received the more invasive treatment survived much longer on the average than the patients that were treated with the non-invasive treatment. The study concludes that the invasive treatment is more effective than the non-invasive treatment. So is this an observational study or an experiment? Well, hopefully you'll see pretty quickly that this was an observational study. This is something they went back and looked at after the fact, okay? So this is a retrospective observational study at that. They didn't follow them forward in time. They looked at received, so they're talking about past tense here, whether they received the invasive treatment or they received the non-invasive treatment, okay? On further investigation of the data and the records, it was discovered the invasive treatment were reserved for relatively healthy patients. Patients who were too ill to tolerate such treatment received the non-invasive treatment. Comment on the validity of the conclusion of the study based upon that. Well, you know, obviously I really don't have to type too much here, but you can see that if the patient was already at the point where they were too ill to receive the invasive treatment, then they were probably, their survival chances were very low to begin with already. So the invasive treatment, so our invasive treatment here, I'll make sure I spell it right here for you. The invasive treatment group was healthier to start. Healthier, so let's say there, excuse me, healthy. I can't remember, it's IEIR. You guys fill in the gaps for me there, okay? So if they were healthier to start than the non-invasive group, then they already had a much better chance of survival even before they had any sort of treatment. Okay, that was a lot of information really fast. Do me and you both a favor and go and read this stuff in the book. There's a fairly short reading assignment for chapter 3, but there's a lot of information in there. And it is stuff that we will be using later on in the course, okay? All right, I enjoyed playing this one with you, and we'll see you all back here for chapter 4. Oh, wait, no, it's section 3.4. I got one more to do.